Welcome back to That's Ancient History. I'm your host, Jean Meas, and today I am joined by a very exciting guest. This is author Luna McNamara, who has a background in Greek languages, philosophy, and has even studied women and gender of world religion and all of this expertise and love of these subjects. She has poured into her incredible debut novel, which you can see behind me if you're watching this, Psyche and Eros, which is, unsurprisingly, a retelling or a novel inspired by the myth of Psyche and Eros, as opposed to Eros and Psyche. I like that it's that way round.
Oh, she comes first. She
Yeah,
comes first on this.
100%.
But thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of you having me on the show.
Of course. I genuinely love the book, and I was just saying before we officially started the podcast there that I think I'd been waiting for this myth retelling to have been written for as long as I've been reading myth retellings, because it's one of the stories that I think is genuinely the most enjoyable and the easiest to root for the characters in. So to have somebody bring that into a whole novel, not just like a little story in somebody else's novel, is really exciting.
I really appreciate that. And one thing I was saying before too is I think there are, first of all, I think it is one of the real love stories that we can root for in Greek mythology. And Greek mythology has a lot of sometimes they're billed as love stories, but there's not a lot of mutual affection in them.
Yeah.
Um, And the story of Eros and Psyche is different in that way, where there is this care between the characters.
It's
And there
lovely.
are also a lot of different ways that you can go with retelling the myth of Eros and Psyche.
I'm excited to dive in more actually to your approach because I've got lots of questions, and what I love about your book and a lot of retellings in general is that you think you know a story and you think you know what you're getting in for, and even just based on the choices you as an author make in the direction you're going to go, which myths you're going to involve, there's still all these twists and turns and surprises that were so fun to read. Even from the very beginning, I was not expecting Eros to be the primordial Eros, who is there from the beginning of the universe, who comes into creation without really being anybody's child, out of chaos at the same time as Gaia and Eris. And I remember when I first learned that version of the myth when I was studying at university, and I was really surprised because I had, baby Cupid, child of Venus and Aphrodite in my head, and to learn there was this older version of Eros was not what I was expecting to read in the book, and I loved that. And I'm really curious what motivated you to take Eros in that direction, and how you decided to mesh those myths together.
Absolutely. So that was a little bit of a turn away from the Eros and Psyche myth as we get it in Apuleius's Golden Ass, which, I take any opportunity I can to say golden ass on
Best
any kind of
title.
interview. Um, but that was in part inspired by the philosophy of Empedocles, who is a pre-Socratic philosopher. My bachelor's degree is in philosophy, and so that was a lot of my introduction to the Greeks. But he has this idea of love and strife as the two underlying forces of the universe. In Greek, this is Eros and Eris.
Yeah.
Very nice little
Yes, the symmetry.
sounds nice and has a nice mouthfeel.
Yeah.
But I was really interested in getting at that to kind of humanize what it might be like to be a god. And one of the delights of Greek mythology is how human the gods are. Even when they're ancient and primordial, they're still getting little slights over on each other. They're still playing pranks. They're still getting their petty revenges. So that was something I wanted to play around with the character of Eros. And looking at the ancient texts and the artistic traditions as well, I do want to acknowledge there is a robust tradition of portraying Eros as the child of Aphrodite, as you said, as this kind of little roly-poly baby guy. I didn't want to do that for a romance novel, so I decided to pivot to this other interpretation as well. And I think some of my approach to the ancient sources comes from my training that I was originally planning to be a professor of religious studies until I looked at how the American academia was doing and decided to pivot myself as well. Um, but a lot of I think one thing that's important to keep in mind with the ancient sources, and something that informed my approach to writing this novel, was that these ancient sources are not eyewitness reports. Um, they they're composed with something other than pure accuracy in mind. They're often written hundreds of years after the events that they purportedly describe. So I think approaching them with this hermeneutic of suspicion and this idea of like, all right, so the source text says this, but like what actually happened? Might this be a gloss on something else? Quoting one of my graduate school professors, what is this evidence actually evidence of? It might not be that these are the events as exactly they occurred. It probably speaks more to the cultural values and priorities of the people who wrote them down. So that's something that very much informed my approach. And also, as a novelist and an artist, I wanted to take what the source text gave us and use that as material to make something new and something that spoke to the people of the modern day,
Yeah,
which is always such a challenge for an academic, I think. How do you bridge that ancient and
yeah,
modern?
you've sort of got two parts of you existing in the sort of the modern person, the reader who wants to read about things they relate to and enjoy and are curious about, and then you've got the okay, but I'm also representing people that lived thousands of years ago and what they wrote down, and oh, I don't want to like misrepresent anything, and I can absolutely understand that sort of it's not too conflicting, so I almost feel like you can do something really interesting with those two things, like create
Yeah, I
something.
think it's a tension that you can use to springboard to a very, very rich discussion. And I think novelists writing about the ancient world or about mythology were always doing that dance at all times, trying to balance between the ancient and the modern day.
Yeah,
Um,
I
and
I always
personally, I skew a little bit more towards the modern day because, I'm an author. I gotta appeal to the publishers. I gotta appeal to the trends.
I mean, like I always say though, that's what the ancient Greek playwrights were doing. You know, they were still writing hundreds of years after even maybe an epic poem told the same story telling, and then they maybe tell it in a way that's relevant. I always think of Euripides writing the Trojan Women, which becomes very much about how the women are enslaved and quite a sympathetic look at the horrors of war, not just the glory of war, because his people had recently and were at war. So like he's influenced by his current situation, and that's kind of the beauty of myth. It's like we can explore our own modern experiences no matter how modern that is in them.
Yes, exactly. And the joy of the ancient sources is that you can see these the secondary scholarship that stretches over centuries, and the way that even the myths, the way that they're retold in different times speak to each other. I'm delving into the Argonautica for my second book and looking at the Apollonius Rhodius version where he's operating in this very Hellenistic milieu where suddenly this idea of this like bronze age strong war leader, like that no longer works here. This is a very urbanized society. That is not the model of leadership we need. And so Apollonius Rhodius's Jason is someone who's much more diplomatic, someone who rules through his relationships rather than chopping off heads all the time. Ah, it's so fun. I
And
love these
a bit of
discussions.
involvement there from Eros as well in that story,
Oh
going
yes, yeah, he has a little
gadfly
cameo
stinging
too.
people. I genuinely think, is it behind me yet? Oh, my glasses have fallen down. I've still got my like old copy of Apollonius from university because I did my undergraduate dissertation on this book. So it's all like
Oh
tabbed
my
up.
gosh,
I
really?
did my dissertation on the erotic similes and metaphors. So Eros in the
So
Argonautica was like my jam.
yeah, and also that the invocation of Erato, the muse of erotic poetry. I'm like,
Yes.
oh, get a girl, yes.
It's so different from Homer. It's so exciting.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
but
so,
I'm
but it
excited.
makes sense that the Hellenistic societies were, oh, in a way, as far removed from Homeric era Greek as they are from us. Like these are very
Homer.
different societies with different concerns,
Yeah,
and yet
absolutely.
the same myths speak to all of them.
Absolutely. And actually, talking about sort of modern versus ancient perceptions. One of the themes that felt very central to the novel throughout, and felt like it was sort of playing with modern versus ancient themes, is the idea of the hero and the heroic in the story. Because we start with Psyche being told, well, her father being told that his child is going to conquer a monster that not that even the gods fear, and then she gets raised to be a traditional hero. You know, she's got Atalanta teaching her the ways of the hero, and she's got this perception where she sort of idolizes the heroes of the past, like Perseus and Bellerophon, and then that's constantly sort of confronted throughout the book, which I thought was really interesting when she meets Medusa, and Medusa says, "What do you think a hero really is?" And then she sees the terrible things that Agamemnon does, and I was wondering, when you're writing about heroism, if sort of you were intentionally playing and sort of touching on what modern ideas of heroism maybe are compared to ancient versions.
That's definitely what I was doing, and kind of looking at this idea of self-aggrandizement and heroism of this as this like lone majestic hero, and saying, is this really what we need now? And this is a place where that engagement with secondary sources really came in handy. So starting around in the 1970s, we started to see this scholarly recognition that actually Psyche's story in many ways parallels the trials of more traditional heroes, thinking of Heracles and his labors, Theseus' labors, this idea that you prove your worth and your goodness by undertaking these impossible tasks. And that's what kind of made me want to twist the prophecy in the original story that it's she'll marry a monster. But the way I depict it is it's Psyche's father visiting the Oracle of Delphi, which is this female oracle connected to a god, but also surrounded by this male priesthood that interprets her words.
Mm.
So from the beginning, I tried to have this question of like, what's interpretation? What gets lost? What is, something that we're misunderstanding? Um, and trying to have that baked in from the start, but also then turn around and use it to question our ideals.
I thought that that came through really well throughout the novel. It was so consistent, and you sort of followed Psyche on that journey of um not just like discovering what hero meant, but figuring out what hero meant to her.
Mhm.
And I think I mean, maybe I'm a bit soppy, but I think it's nice to be able to consider love as part of heroism. It doesn't have to be a thing of violence, which it often feels like. So that was just nice as a reader.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits that we get of reading Psyche's story as a hero's journey, is like
Mm.
it becomes something else, that her goal is ultimately reunification with the beloved. It isn't, conquering a great monster or being remembered in a certain way. That it's in the end about love.
So
But
hard to sort of figure out whether you're spoiling a myth.
I know. I had my mother actually texted me when it first came out, and she's like, I think this might be a spoiler. And I'm like, Mom, it's, the myth has been available for about 1800 years now. It's,
But what
what.
you've done in this novel, and I think like other novelists doing retellings, is that even though we kind of know the ending, or I think we know the ending, there's still enough surprises in the way that you tell it and the way that you build the characters and flesh them out in a way that unfortunately you don't necessarily get in quite a brief version of their story from antiquity. You get these much fuller characters, and that is so much richer and more important than knowing the ending.
Yeah, yeah, from an artistic and literary standpoint, like the idea of what are the stakes here? And the stakes in a reinterpretation like this, they might not be the same as they are in the myth. There may be a little tweaked. So readers, still more to enjoy.
Oh, so many surprises. And I loved your characterization of Psyche. She felt like such a whole, real, fully rounded person who grows throughout the novel, who isn't even always the same person throughout the novel. And I was curious about like when you first read about Psyche, what kind of person did you see her as, and if that changed as you wrote about Psyche, as opposed to just, the golden ass Psyche.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Let me see. So the characterization of Psyche in The Golden Ass is it's fascinating. It's very contradictory. Apuleius seems often very invested as portraying her as this sweet little innocent girl who, knowingly makes some poor decisions. And yet there also is, even in that source text, there is this strength of character and this complexity that really can't be erased. Like in the source text, when Psyche is being marched off to the mountain to meet the monster that she's prophesied to marry, the people of the town are following her. They're weeping. They're afraid she's going to die. They'll never see her again. And she turns around and says to them, basically, like, "Don't cry for me. I was born to do this. This is all happening as it's supposed to." And for a young woman going to what she thinks is her death, like, that's pretty impressive. Um, so I was interested in portraying both of that. Like, Psyche is still a young mortal woman. She's got her flaws. But she does also have the strength of character as well.
Yeah, it really does come through. And actually, it was really nice to see the characterization of Eros as well. And I think you mentioned earlier about sort of almost exploring the personality and almost humanity of gods because he also, despite being a primordial deity, still feels like a character who, might not have the same problems I do as a mortal person, but you could still relate to him and sort of see things through his eyes. And he felt very fully well-rounded. And I think that helps you root for them as a couple because they're both very real people, even if one of them is a god and one of them is a mortal.
Mhm.
Which is
Exactly. And Eros, it took me a little while to get a hold on his character because I mean he is so complex. The idea of this ancient immortal being that also is still desperately seeking meaning in his life, seeking a purpose. Um, so I read a lot of Anne Rice books as a teenager. I'm watching the new show
yeah.
now, so this is very in my mind. But I think the Anne Rice's idea of the vampire as this immortal figure that still has these very human desires for connection, for purpose, for meaning.
Mm.
That very much fed into my characterization of Eros and of the other Greek gods as well.
I mean, that kind of just points to the sort of interconnectedness of our interpretation of all kind of myths and legends, whether they're sort of like literary legends or folklore or mythology, and that sort of someone looks to a vampire, what would it be like to live forever? What would it be like to live forever as a god? And of course, we're curious about that. And you've already really actually mentioned that this has influenced you, but I'm curious more about like how your background in studying like women in world religion potentially played into writing Psyche and Eros's story. Did that impact you as a writer, and also like outside of Greek myth, do you feel you were influenced by other mythologies?
Absolutely. Yeah. Um I think some of it is I'm very fortunate with my academic background to have kind of this pool of knowledge to draw from, to have like kind of a sense of what it might be like to be this young girl with a great deal of self-determination and focus, being at a wedding where the violent removal of the bride is part of the ceremony. Um, but also thinking about like a lot of women's studies and world religion now, there's a lot of focus on agency. So there's a lot of notice on a lot of research on the deficits as well, on the ways that women are treated unequally in religion. But what's of particular interest to scholars now is like, okay, taking that into account, what are the ways that women still had agency in these situations? What are the ways that they learned to benefit from their situations? Why do they continue in these paradigms of thought that might not make them the most foremost or preeminent?
Mm.
Uh, and so some of that was like this pool of knowledge that I drew from in shaping the characters in the story.
Yeah, I mean, and there is like so much nuance, isn't there? It's like we're not going to pretend that historically there wasn't a patriarchy which was creating an unequal world for women, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't nuance and there wasn't like moments of strength and agency in their lives. That
Exactly.
yeah, no,
Yes.
that's actually
And-
true.
Mhm. And so kind of this strengths-based approach would be like, all right, yeah, taking this as this is an unequal patriarchal society, how did women, despite that, still find agency? How did they still get what they wanted? How was what they wanted shaped by their circumstances?
And actually, it's kind of interesting. I only just really thought about this, that aside from Eros, all of the gods or deities in the book that have the most significant roles are women, really. You know, from
Yeah,
Gaia to Hecate to Demeter and Aphrodite, they're all women.
exactly. And there's a lot of diversity in their portrayals as well. Like Aphrodite is the villain in the story. She is gorgeous, she is feminine, and she is vicious as well. And I kind of liked having that. Like I like a good, delicious female villain, because I think women can contain and encompass a lot of different traits, and sometimes when you're fully human, one of those can be villainy.
Yeah.
But then in the form of Medusa, I also wanted to explore the perspective of someone who was wronged and victimized by these ideals of heroism, and how she reflected on that, how she was able to heal from it.
Yeah.
And you know, if anyone's going to give a critique of the heroic, I think it has to be Medusa.
Yes. She is a
She's
victim of
having such a
heroism.
moment now.
Yeah. She is. It's incredible actually because, growing up, I feel like all the pop culture I watched was very much, the sort of um Clash of the Titans. Medusa is a big snake monster.
Mhm. And like that's a fun interpretation. We love a good snake monster, but there's so much more there as well.
Yeah. And it's a way to explore the sort of realities of women's lives as well, because as much as this is a myth retelling and this is a myth that we're dealing with, you're still writing about an ancient society, and that comes through sort of in the book, these little details about kind of the sort of relationship with guests and what it was like to be a peasant versus a princess, and there's clearly a lot of historical research in there as well, and it does make me curious as well about your research process, and did you have to crack out a lot of ancient history books as along with the mythology?
I cracked some. I think Psyche and Eros, I do want to steer away from it being interpreted as pure historical fiction
No,
because I
yeah,
did take a lot of liberties.
yeah.
But like the role of women in the society as, you know, you still are the wife of the king, mother of the future heir, but also your sphere was circumscribed also. Like there were you had a narrow kind of parcel of existence to live in. You had a lot of constraints on you, like this idea of that Clytemnestra in my book says of silence as a woman's greatest adornment. And also the character of Clytemnestra, as I saw her in this book, was really someone who wrestles with respectability politics and fails. Like she tries to fit the mold of a woman and then uh, sees the death of her daughter and realizes how useless that is.
Oh, I was that was the number of myths you were able to include in this story beyond Eros and Psyche was really enjoyable as a reader, and I think it in a way it kind of honors how inextricably intertwined mythology is in general. But you managed to sort of really touch with depth and empathy on things like the Trojan War and the Oresteia cycle, and I wonder what the process was of choosing what myths got included aside from Eros and Psyche, because you had to make a lot of choices there, and obviously there's a grand selection you can pick from. So kind of
Yes, and my editors were like, okay, you gotta scale this back a little bit, and I did. But in a way, that was a nod to the source text from Apuleius, where the Golden Ass has Lucius, the main character, bumping into all of these stock characters of his day, like the Galai priestesses, um, the Christians, those hidden, those terrible degenerate people. Um, so there's this idea of like Apuleius is bumping into all these stock characters, kind of exploring the modern myths of his moments. And I
Mhm.
wanted to do that a little bit as well with the characters from Greek mythology. And in terms of thinking about which to include, I looked for either characters that appeared in the source text that weren't really fleshed out. Zephyrus is a great example of this. Or looking at characters whose stories paralleled the one I was trying to tell in Psyche and Eros, which is why I included Atalanta, who is also just one of my favorite figures from mythology ever.
And not talked about enough. Like one of the greatest heroes who is
Yeah,
a woman, and in a
amazing.
masculine way, obviously not in reality of gender because that's obviously nonsense, but like in the sense of like what is associated with masculine heroes of antiquity, she does the masculine things, which is incredible.
Mhm.
Loved Iphigenia as well, another character who like has just continually been overlooked, I feel. So it was nice to see her in there.
And I also, with Iphigenia, I also like, I think that that moment of her sacrifice is what we often focus on, and the ways it's told is also so intriguing. But I also wanted to think about what sort of person she might be. And she's described as a priestess of Artemis. So what might that have been like? Like, we know priestesses were very independent. Um, they were respected in their society in a way that many women weren't. What was it like to be a priestess?
No, I really enjoyed that. And that was sort of like where the, again, not a historical novel, but like the historical detail comes in because you're sort of seeing Iphigenia the priestess, not just what happens to her at the end. You make allusions to the idea that Clytemnestra was an enslaved woman, part of a previous sort of storm on a city, and all of the ways that like women's lives are impacted by other aspects, not just their marriage, not just who they're married to and who they're the queen of. It's like these other things happen to them too, horrific, good, bad, what have you. And it was really kind of nice to see that nuance of women's lives in antiquity.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and like understanding that patriarchy does shape their lives, but also that they're more than wife of, daughter of, mother of. They are thinking, breathing human beings with concerns of their own. And in thinking about the way that the Eros and Psyche story is conceptualized in Apuleius and the way that tale is framed, it's a story that the main character hears told in this den of bandits. And specifically, it's an elderly, probably enslaved woman who is the bandits' cook, who tells the story to a younger woman who's been kidnapped by the bandits, who's afraid that she's going to be raped,
Mhm.
and who has these very legitimate fears about marriage and sexuality. And the older woman basically says, look, things will work out. Let me tell you this story.
See, even in the Golden Ass, there's sort of a recognition there that this is a happy-ish. Obviously, well, you know, you got
Yeah.
ups and downs, twists and turns, but it's a hopeful, um, generally quite upbeat story for Greek
Mhm.
mythology. Is
Yeah.
that something that sort of originally drew you to it? Like, did you sort of think, oh, I want to write about that myth where something nice happens?
I think that was so I wrote the vast majority, pretty much the whole first draft during the pandemic,
Mm.
which, is a collective trauma that I think we're all still processing. Um, but I was living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time. I had been laid off from work. I had gone through a bad breakup. Basically, it felt like everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. And I'd had this idea about a novelization of the Eros and Psyche story, and I had absolutely nothing else to do. So I was like, all right, let's dive in on this. But just being able to exist in this mythological landscape and in this story that is ultimately about love and about the ascent of the soul, which I'll get to in a moment, um, it made my experience of the pandemic much more bearable. And I hope that striving and that optimism for the future and that hope is, I hope it reaches the readers as well, because the story really was a bright thread to me in a very dark time. And I hope I can extend that to someone else.
I think hope is definitely one of the big themes of it, sort of like hope in lots of different levels, and I do think that that comes through. And it's just a wonderful book to read. It does bring joy. It brought me joy.
Oh, that delights me. That delights me to hear. That's really what I set out to do. And I think also one thing that's fun about it isn't just a love story between two people. It's also a bit of learning how to love yourself and learning how to love your community and the world around it. And that comes from at least my reading of the source text as well in Apuleius, where the author of that story was someone who was very active in mystery religions, um, very active in mysticism of his day, which often centered around the idea of the ascent of the soul through the Platonic levels of matter. Um, and in the source texts, Psyche is going through this process of undergoing the labors, but also undergoing a kind of perfecting of herself, of greater capacity, greater generosity, drawing on the help of others, and this improvement on a soul level. So I tried to capture that as well, that they don't just fall in love, they also improve as individuals.
Understanding your background actually in ancient philosophy and just philosophy in general, I can kind of now see more how that is in the book in a obviously philosophy can be one of those terrifying, dense, intimidating subjects. I remember being like this for a lot of my classes in university. But in quite an accessible way, and you've actually channeled, yeah, these philosophical schools of thoughts into a very accessible sort of reading experience in Psyche and Eros to a certain extent, which is nice.
Thank you. I really strive to do that. And I think a lot of ancient philosophy, oh my God, it can get very brain bendy. I feel like especially Aristotle is so
Oh, I literally was just having a rant like 2 days ago because I was organizing my bookcases and I was just like,
bad.
if if Aristotle has no haters, then I am dead. I was
Well,
just
I've never really forgiven him for the women are inferior men thing.
just
I'm
done
like,
a niche reference. Like my like diehard favorite ancient philosopher is Lucretius. I'm an
ooh, a
Epicurean
deep
girl.
cut. I love that.
And his whole like I like the little bits. I know it's not real science in terms of what we understand now, but like all his little atomic theory, I'm like, oh, I love it. It's
Oh,
great.
I love the pre-Socratic philosophers like
Yeah,
trying to figure out the natural world, like Thales and his like, well, I think everything is based on water because of these
yeah,
things. And it's like, oh,
it's
you're so
brilliant.
close.
Yeah, right? Like so close in so many ways that I'm just like honestly, and they didn't have, the like abilities or the technology that we have today, and they still got that close, and I'm like, well done.
Yeah, it is, but it's fascinating in the capacity of human beings that it's evidence of. I'm like, oh, I just love
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Um, but I think a lot of ancient philosophy, and especially a little more towards the Hellenistic and Roman eras, is really about how to live and how to die.
Hmm.
How do we do those things in the best way? And that is an eternal evolving question, but I tried to touch on that, some of that in Psyche and Eros. Death and immortality are major themes of the book.
Okay.
Um, some of that I think was inspired by my current day job. I'm a social worker. I work largely with older adults, and just seeing the breadth of experience, the depths of joy and the depths of sorrow that someone has seen at 70, 80, 90 years old. Um, like it is staggering. Like a human life is an epic.
It truly, and it's actually something that is quite like touching at the beginning of the book when Eros sort of is trying to kind of figure out himself and what desire and love means, and he sees this older couple who've obviously been together for a very long time and still find comfort in one another, and this kind of like makes him curious about humans. What are they up to?
Yeah. Like, wait, I think maybe that started from one of my arrows, but they're so
What's
different
beyond?
now. Their love is so different. What's happening?
Yeah. No, I did. I enjoyed that because for all that he is this almost ageless being, he starts the book with a level of immaturity.
Hmm. Yeah. And
Like,
that's the fun of the Greek gods is that they're immortal and divine. They're also so very human. And they get to be a mirror for us and our experiences.
yeah, absolutely. I had this conversation with Jennifer Saint actually recently when we were recording an episode about just the idea of almost like the chicken and egg god and human thing, where it's sort of like the gods influence humans, but also gods exist because of humans. So it's like, where does the line stop between what is god and what is human?
Yes, exactly. Like what are the gods without human beings?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I no, I yeah. I feel like I love when I read an interview or watch an interview or get to be a part of an interview with someone obviously that's written a book I enjoyed, because it sort of adds this level of enjoyment and sort of thought to the book that I enjoyed in the reading experience, and now I've sort of got all these extra layers to it, and it's really, really interesting hearing everything you were thinking, because there's so many layers there to this story, and it's incredible. I'm really excited, in fact, to see what you're going to do with Jason and Medea.
Thank you. Yeah, that's publishing is such a funny industry because like I'll be doing promotion and interviews for the book that's out, but like in my own time I'm working on this whole other book and that's really where my brain is right now.
Yeah.
And if it's all right, I would love to talk a little bit about the next idea.
Please.
Still in edits, tentative release next year. Um, but so the Argonautica, story of Jason and the Argonauts. But if you read that story, it really feels like Medea is the hero. I mean, not only is she the one who gives Jason the ability to survive his trials with the bulls and with the little monster, the dragon teeth soldiers. But she's also in the Argonautica, she is given this incredible level of complexity that is unique in the story and really kind of unique in ancient literature, that you get to see her falling in love with Jason, her being torn between loyalties to her family and to this super hunk who's rolled in here. So she's a very interesting character in the Argonautica, and especially in light of Euripides' Medea, which details the later half of her life. Um, but what I'm focusing on in my book is looking at the relationship between Jason and Medea, yes, but also the relationship between Medea and the only other woman on the Argo, Atalanta.
Who often
So you
gets
get to see
forgotten about. Like, I feel like when people talk about the
often forgotten,
Argonautica,
yeah.
they forget that she was there.
Oh yes, and on some lists of the Argonauts, she isn't included, but the list of the Argonauts, they're like, I don't know, everyone wanted to get their ancestor on the Argo, so like the list varies so widely. But in Apollonius Rhodius, there's this really interesting part where like, oh yes, and Jason didn't let her aboard because he was worried the men would fall in love with her, but she gave him her super cool spear. Like, so I don't know. I think Apollonius Rhodius, he doth protest too much. I assume Atalanta was on the Argo.
I fully believe
But a lot of what I'm interested in exploring is the relationship between these two powerful women that in many ways choose um, different strategies in a patriarchal society. Like Medea is this more domestic figure, although she has this untamed streak in her witchcraft. Atalanta, on the other hand, strives for this more independent life, but also is a figure in whom, like, love has a major role in Atalanta's life with Meleager, with Melanion. And so this conflict between love and freedom is very interesting with the two of them.
it makes me curious actually to think, obviously, aside from the fact that we're still talking about Greek and Roman myth, because Atalanta is playing a part in both these stories, do you kind of see them as happening in the same universe? Like this is almost
Oh
a
yes.
Eros and
Yeah,
Psyche.
Psyche and Eros have cameos in the new book. And yeah, this is you get to see Atalanta's younger years.
Oh, I love it. Well, you're creating a whole like, obviously, again, like this is Greek mythology, but like that doesn't mean that it all fits together nicely. So it's kind of cool to see how you're imagining it all fitting together nicely, and it's creating a little MCU.
Exactly, the McNamara cinematic
I love
universe.
it. I love it. Well, I actually ask every single guest on the podcast the exact same question when we come to the sort of end of our discussion. So don't feel too much pressure because it doesn't matter what you say, but I always ask for a book recommendation. And it doesn't have to be, an ancient
Oh.
Greek text. It can literally be whatever you want, and I will accept your offering.
All right. Do you have like a limit on it? Because I can imagine I'm like, oh man, I have all
There
these
can be
suggestions.
multiple. There can be multiple.
Okay. All right. Um, yeah, it's gonna be
No
multiple.
pressure.
So for the Eros and Psyche myth, Sarah Rudin's translation of the Golden Ass is so fun, so engaging.
Okay.
Uh, Ruden is the translator's last name. Highly recommend it. A scholar who's studying the Eros and Psyche myth and is an Apuleius expert is Dr. Regine May. And she's recently put out a manuscript about the myth that she very kindly sent to me and is absolutely fantastic. So, Dr. Regine May, highly recommend her work. And in terms of fiction, I have absolutely fallen in love with the Wolf Den trilogy by Elodie Harper.
Ooh.
3 books: The Wolf Den, The House with the Golden Door, and Temple of Fortuna. And this is about a young woman who is sold into slavery, who is sold to a brothel in Pompeii, and her fight for survival in the antique world. And it's truly one of the most original historical trilogies of our time. You get to see how the everyday person lived in the Roman world.
I think I might have the Wolf Den on my bookshelf actually. Like at first I was like, as soon as you started describing, I was like, I think I have that. I need to read it.
I will say the Wolf Den does come with a lot of trigger warnings. This
Yes.
is a woman who is non-consensually sold into a brothel. Um, Protect yourself as needed, content warnings up the wazoo. Um, but it is an incredibly well-researched book. Elodie Harper puts in all these little fun Easter eggs from Pompeian archaeology. And I personally absolutely love this view of the ancient world that is not from the perspective of elite men,
Mhm.
because so many of our sources are.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
if I can sneak in one more,
Please do.
um, this is fiction, but The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi is about this mysterious heiress of this hotel chain that's known for its mythological and folklore motifs, who begins this, shall we say, romance full of secrets with a jaded academic.
Ooh,
And it is
know the author,
in
but
some
I have not read that.
Mhm. It's very good, and it is in its own way, I think, inspired by the Eros and Psyche myth.
Oh,
So
I
Last
love
Tale of
it.
the Flower Bride is another recommendation.
Oh well, even if I mean, I'm sure everyone listening is also picking these books up, but I've got a few recommendations, so I'm appreciative. Oh well, thank you so much for coming on. It was so fascinating hearing more about like your research and your interests and sort of how you went about writing Psyche and Eros, see where it all started and the wonderful place it's ended up. And yeah, it was lovely to chat.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.